The second lesson is from the little letter ascribed to James, the brother of Jesus and leader of the First Church of Jerusalem, first chapter. Nobody who fails to keep a tight rein on his tongue can claim to be religious. This is mere self-deception. That person's religion is worthless. Pure, unspoiled religion in the eyes of God our Father is this: coming to the help of widows and orphans in their troubles, and keeping oneself uncontaminated by the culture around. So religion, presumably that's what we're all about Sunday by Sunday here in this place. Yet the word in our time, I think, has taken on a rather forbidding ring. One of our young preachers on Youth Sunday a year or two ago said it like this. He said he liked this church because it's not so religious that it bores him. And I'm sure that there are many who make that equation. You know, religion equals boredom. I've encountered many a human being who describes themselves to their pastor by saying, well, I'm not a very religious person, but. We do use the word, of course, in a neutral sense. He belongs to such and such a religion. We study comparative religion at the university. Bob Hope once said, I do benefits for all religions. I'd hate to blow the hereafter on a technicality. But the negative ring sounds when we're talking about pious ways, manners, when we say somebody has got religion. Peter Ustinov once said, the habit of the religion of many I see as oppressive. All this kind of unfortunate because a very noble word that finally has nothing to do with sex, S-E-C-T-S, or manners. Religion is not finally the various forms and rituals and creeds that we often associate with the word. It certainly doesn't refer to a certain swarmy type of personality or pious appearance or smile or emotional imperialism, at least not according to the writer of the little letter of James, brother of Jesus. His is a classic definition, I think. Genuine religion is this: to take care of orphans and widows in their troubles and to keep oneself from being corrupted by the contemporary culture. Let's take the second part of the definition first. Where I grew up, we had to, in the Baptist church I grew up in, we had to memorize Bible verses, and this is one I had to memorize in the old King James Version, where it says, to keep oneself unspotted by the world. Trouble is, nobody bothered to explain it to me, and I remember the verse disturbing me quite a bit because I usually arrived home from school or play quite spotted from the world. But it highlights a dimension of healthy, authentic religion without which, I suggest, neither individual nor society can even survive. All great religion, you see, involves a controlling view of life, its meaning, its purpose, its behavior against the confusing and chaotic and ideas and attitudes peddled by the culture over the years. High religion always involves, therefore, restraint, control, struggling to keep ourselves from corruption by the current cultural values as they inevitably contradict the high demands of our faith, of our God, of our Jesus. Real religion means surrender to, submission to, control by fundamental principles and perspectives and injunctions, because without these, we human beings become victims of every external pressure or fad or internal impulse that comes along. We lose both our sense of dignity and our sense of direction. We've all been saddened and shocked by the massacre in the Colorado high school this week. And far be it for me to attempt to explain what happened there. We know so little. These were obviously, at least by most testimonies, young men who were alienated and angry, but certainly they bear some responsibility for that alienation and anger. And certainly there must be adults who failed to help them develop a view of life, a faith that would enable them to cope with their alienation and anger. But there are some reports that in their alienation they seemed empty of spiritual resources that would have restrained them and directed them And so they became fair game for a more demonic point of view, which in their minds justified their anger and their violence, gave them, in other words, permission to act it out. One man who has worked for years with troubled young people comments, "Yes, it was a tragedy that took place at a public school, but I'm not sure if it was just another school shooting tragedy. Yes, they were within their own culture, and jocks didn't like them and probably made fun of them. But that's usually not enough to drive people to such extreme. There was something else going on. And what we think was going on was a different worldview about how to respond to life, cobbled together by eclectic forms of anarchism and nihilism. They acted out their beliefs." It's not true, as G.K. Chesterton said, that when someone ceases to believe in God, they believe in nothing. The problem, he said, is they will believe in everything. Well, I don't pretend to know what went on inside these young minds. I can tell you what ensures young people pretty well against such disastrous ways: commitment to internalization of a faith and a view of reality which affirms them as important and valuable, no matter what the crowd thinks, and which calls them to responsible ways. And all in the context, I might add, of relationships that are strong at home and in the church, relationships which reinforce such a view, such a way. The word from the Latin religio means to bind oneself to God and His will. And behind it lies the insight that we're not truly free to be human and happy unless we are bound. Unless we are bound to eternal perspectives and principles, no matter the current fads and drift. And a society that forgets this, that loses sight of this, is headed inevitably for chaos and confusion and collapse, no matter how profound its institutions. A Russian Christian who lived through it, the philosopher Nicholas Berdyaev, once wrote, "Human beings without God are no longer human." That is the religious meaning of modern history. Interiorly divided, drained of their spiritual discipline, human beings become the slave of base and inhuman influences. Their souls are darkened and alien spirits easily take possession. The flowering of the idea of humanity was possible only so long as a man had deep belief in and consciousness of principles above himself, and was not altogether cut off from divine roots. The man who has lost God gives himself up to anything formless and inhuman forces that crush him, that becloud his image, that beat upon him like waves from every side. It is these forces, not man, who is set free. April 20th was the 100th birthday of Adolf Hitler, or it was the birthday of Adolf Hitler, the very day that these young people chose to set out on this path of destruction. The English historian Paul Johnson writes about the destruction and tyranny let loose in the 20th century. He writes that Marx and Freud, powerful figures in Europe, assumed that religion was an old impulse that was fantasy and it would fade away. Nietzsche, the third of the trio, was also atheist. Nietzsche, you never heard of him? The kids out there in Colorado have. Our kids read him at New Trier High School, and that's all right, as long as they read something else as well. He wrote in 1886, "The greatest event of recent times is the death of God." That is, the belief in the Christian God. It is no longer tenable, and that reality is beginning to cast its first shadows over Europe. The decline and collapse of the religious impulse, he said, would leave a large vacuum which would produce new messiahs uninhibited by old-fashioned religious restraint. Prophet before his time. I ask you, is not the history of the last 100 years the story of the loss of religious restraint upon political institutions and persons? I'm convinced that democracy only became possible on this planet, that which we treasure so, with the development in the West of a certain kind of personality. Character type, sociologists like to call it. The kind of person who is, for the most part, self-governing, governed by an interior judge and Lord. And I really wonder whether it will be possible to sustain democracy over the long haul if the erosion of that kind of personal self-discipline and commitment, that kind of religion, ceases to exist among us. As with nations, so with individuals, we have developed an incredible reticence about absolute values, fundamental principles. We resist passing judgment on anybody else's conduct. The first rule of social life in our time, whether in office or on the campus, is tolerance of all kinds of deviation and distortion of human life. What does the Lord require of us? We're called to bind ourselves, religio, to certain rules and standards, because if we don't, we not only wreak havoc on the world around us, we destroy our own souls. True freedom, true life, true happiness stems from thus being bound. James says it at another point in his little letter. The man who looks closely at the perfect law, the law that makes us free, and acts upon it is the man who finds happiness. In passing, it's rather interesting, I think, what James gives as a specific example of discipline and restraint, submission to higher law and will. It's not avoidance of sensual abuse, economic dishonesty, self-aggrandizement, important as they might be. It is a seemingly little thing. It is the control of the tongue. Does anyone think he's religious? If he cannot control his tongue, his religion is worthless. I say it seems a little thing, but when you stop and think about it, an awful lot of the suffering and mischief in the world, from the international to the interpersonal, begins with words. It was with words that Hitler first began to tear down Western civilization. It is with words that George and Mary almost destroy a marriage. It surely was with words that much of the mischief and ultimately suffering in Colorado began. It was with words that the conflict in Kosovo first smoldered, inciting tribal hatreds. It is speech out of control, personal and media speech, appealing to impulse, shooting for sensation, competing for attention, that eats at dignity and meaning, that creates anger and bitterness and cynicism, that destroys love and relationship, that seduces into foolishness. James is right. So genuine religion has ultimately little to do with elaborate ritual or pious posture or look. It has to do with submission to a higher will than our own. But lest that sound too severe and forbidding, too Puritan, I suppose some would say, let me point out that it not only constrains us, high religion, good religion, healthy religion, but it also directs us. It not only controls, but it grants us purpose and cause in life. To follow Jesus as Lord is not only to know a certain external control, it's also to know new ways of living and doing and giving and being. Nicholas Berdyaev said that as well. The greatest mystery of life is that satisfaction is felt not by those who take and who make demands, but by those who give and make sacrifices, because in them alone the energy of life does not fail. But there's a special kind of energy and life, direction and purpose that James has in mind. What is the Spirit of Christ which flows from him and through us if we allow it? Genuine religion is this: to take care of orphans and widows in their trouble. Now, doesn't that grab you? Doesn't sound very exciting, does it? On the face of it, what's it all about? The peculiar service and sacrifice that characterized Jesus and James his brother, the service and sacrifice that we are called to is service and sacrifice for the sake of those whom the times and the culture count as worthless, as useless. In those days it was the widows and the orphans. There were no secretarial jobs for you when your husband died or your father. Your whole existence depended upon somebody else. Orphans were abandoned. They had nothing to offer. They were counterproductive, unproductive as far as the economy was concerned, a drag on it. They could give little or nothing in return. And it is precisely reaching out to such as these, says the old book, is where life is found. An awful lot of talk about spirituality in our time, which I find quite upsetting. That's pretty shallow and self-centered because it never leads beyond a kind of narcissistic navel-gazing to real involvement in the nitty-gritty needs of the world around us. That is why the sacrifice and service which leads to real life means standing against, resisting corruption by a lot of the stuff that's going on around us. The culture says, cater to those who can do you some good, love those who may be worth something to you someday, help you with your success. Against that attitude comes the truth of life, the reality that as we reach out to the widows and orphans of our time, the children, the aged, the marginal, the handicapped, whomever has little or nothing to offer us, that it's there we find life's real, its deepest rewards. It may be just a businessman who cares not only about the bottom line, which is right, but who also goes out of his way to acknowledge need in his colleagues or employees. It may mean professionals who not only are concerned about their excellence, but also are able to see before them more than a kidney or a client. In any event, in this church, it's a lot of things. You can read about them on the insert in your bulletin. You tutor at Cabrini or Good News. You visit the retirement homes or teach in the church school. You go to the shut-in or the shut-out. You work tirelessly on committees and boards in order to make it all work on the behalf of others. Rummage, bazaar, funerals, in all the avenues of service that you'll find on that card, and many out beyond that we don't even know about, over 1,000 that we do know. And it may not always be easy and fun, and at times it may be incredibly boring. But this is not just duty, you know that. It's true religion because it's life. The late Henry Nouwen was a spiritual father to many of us through his writings and his example. His career went from days as a very popular professor at Harvard to working with incredibly handicapped children in a home called the Arch in Canada. Shortly before he died up there, Henry wrote this in his diary. Where do we find God? God is where we are weak and hungry and vulnerable and small and dependent. God is where the poor are, the handicapped, the mentally ill, the emotionally disturbed, the elderly, the powerless. But how can we come to know God when our focus is always elsewhere, on success and influence and power? I increasingly believe that our faithfulness will depend upon our willingness to go where there is brokenness and loneliness and need. And if you stop and think about it, you really don't have to go very far to find those. He concludes, I realize now that the only way for us to stay well in the midst of the many worlds around is to stay close to the small, vulnerable child that lives in our hearts and in every human being we encounter. But this consumer society, bless it, focuses us continually on our own wants and needs and desires, does it not? The modern wall is a smorgasbord of tantalizing offerings for every conceivable wish and dream. And even churches are sought out and enjoyed on the basis of what they have to offer us. But we need religion not as an add-on, another set of services for our needs, but precisely as an antidote to all this, to this world of consumption and competition, inevitable but very one-sided. For real life lies not in having our needs met, but in transcending them in concern for others. Set your mind, bind yourself to God's kingdom and His justice before everything else, says Jesus, and the rest will take care of themselves. Ian McCarter was a vice president in the New York branch of an international bank. Ian McCarter talked once about how at age 12 he kind of gave up going to church. His parents didn't go very often, so he kind of followed them out. Then he went on to describe emptiness that began to settle in over his adult years, an emptiness that led him back into a sanctuary in Manhattan one Sunday where he found himself praying for direction. Then, passing the church bulletin board on the way out, he focused on one notice: volunteers urgently needed at St. Luke's Hospital. McCarter found himself there the next evening, somewhat uneasy. in a group that included a lawyer, a housewife, an opera singer, a member of the United Nations Children's Fund, an advertising executive, a grandmother, and a theology undergraduate. But MacArthur says he found new life in that hospital. For one evening, the director of volunteers led him to the pediatrics ward where 6 border babies were sleeping. These little ones, she explained, had been abandoned or had come from drug-addicted mothers or both, and often waited months for adoption or foster care, real orphans, and what they needed most was to be held and loved because otherwise they might not survive. Could you help us, Mr. MacArthur? He said he was petrified. But thereafter, for some time, at 10 o'clock in the evening, you could find Ian MacArthur, bank vice president in pediatrics, cradling one of these babies in his arms. And he wrote, "The emptiness is gone." But it remains only to be said that the religion of which James writes is by definition a voluntary thing. Religion imposed by state or maintained by habit is not authentic faith and life. And that's what's made faith in God and Jesus so vital in this country, the fact that it hasn't just gone along with citizenship as historically it has in Europe, but it's been choice, decision, a controlling view of reality and responsibility, a care and concern for those in need. These have meaning and power only as they are gladly and freely embraced. I'm sympathetic to the little guy who was experiencing his first day of first grade. At lunchtime, he packed up his crayons, papers, scissors, and paste and headed out the door. His teacher caught him, stopped him, and said, "It's time for lunch. Tommy, why aren't you with the other children?" "I always go home when the other kids go to eat," he replied. "I'll come back tomorrow." "No, Tommy, that was last year when you were in kindergarten. This year you get to stay all day. You go to lunch, and then you come back here in the afternoon to study and do some more work. You're only half through for the day. There's lots more." Tommy thought about this for a moment, shook his head in frustration, and grumbled, "Who signed me up for that?" Well, you know, a lot of life is that way. We just sort of got signed up for it along the way. But in the service of God, nobody can sign up for you. The faith that you embrace, the service you render, is only genuine and life-giving when freely and gladly chosen. So choose wisely, choose well, but for God's sake, choose.